The laugh came first. A short, barking laugh that cut through the smell of gun oil and concrete dust. Then the words, "Sir, with all due respect, I don't think you understand what you're asking." The rangemaster was 26 years old, arms crossed over a tactical polo shirt 2 sizes too tight, and he was looking down at a 78-year-old man in a faded denim jacket who had just set a battered hard case on the counter. "This is an M14. This isn't some bolt action you pop open and clean with a toothbrush. We got liability concerns. We got protocol." Behind the old man, a line of weekend shooters shifted uncomfortably. One of them opened his mouth to say something, and then closed it. The old Marine didn't raise his voice, he didn't raise his eyes. He just said, very quietly, "Son, I carried one of these for 14 months in a place you've only read about. I'd like to strip it. That's all I'm asking." And the rangemaster, because he was 26 and because he had a stopwatch app on his phone, and because he thought this would be funny, pulled out that phone and said, "All right, old-timer, show me. I'll even time you." If you believe a man's service is owed respect even when his hands are shaking, type the word honour in the comments right now. Because what happened in the next 47 seconds is something nobody in that range is ever going to forget. His name was Earl Whitaker, and for the better part of 50 years he had lived in a small house, off a county road in eastern Tennessee, the kind of road where the asphalt gives up halfway and turns to gravel without warning. He was a widower. His wife, Margaret, had passed 4 springs ago, and the silence she left behind had settled into the floorboards and the curtains and the coffee cups he still bought in pairs out of habit. He had a son somewhere in Colorado who called on birthdays and sometimes on Christmas, and a granddaughter he had met exactly 3 times. He drove a 1994 Ford F-150 that had more rust than paint, and he kept a folded American flag in a triangular wooden case on the mantel, though if you asked him about it he would change the subject to the weather. Earl was not a tall man. Age had bent him the way age bends men who have done hard physical work for too many years, and there was a tremor in his left hand that hadn't been there 5 years ago. The doctors at the VA had a word for it, but Earl refused to use that word. He called it the shake. On the morning this story begins, the shake had been particularly bad, and he had spilled coffee on the kitchen table and sat there for a long time looking at the brown stain spreading across the wood, and he had thought about his wife, and then he had thought about something else, something he had not thought about in a long while. He had walked out to the old metal shed behind the house, the one he used to call his workshop before his knees gave out, and he had unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the chain on the bare light bulb and stood there in the dust-filled air, looking at a grey hard case sitting on the top shelf. It had been there since 1971. What was inside that case had been inside it, untouched, for 54 years, and today, for a reason Earl could not fully articulate even to himself, he wanted to hold it again. Just once. Just to see if his hands still remembered something his mind was starting to forget. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that the decision he made that morning would unravel, in the course of a single afternoon, a silence he had been keeping since before most of the men at that gun range were born. The Ridgeline Tactical Shooting Range sat off Route 58 about 9 miles outside of town, a low cinder block building with a corrugated metal roof and a gravel parking lot that doubled as overflow for the diner across the street. Earl had never been to this particular range. His usual place, a friendlier outdoor setup run by a career-era vet named Doug, had closed 2 years ago when Doug's heart gave out. Ridgeline was the closest one left, and Earl had driven past it maybe 100 times without ever once considering going inside. It had a reputation. Young guys, ex-military and wannabe ex-military, tactical gear, a lot of patches and a lot of opinions. Earl pulled into the gravel lot a little before 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. The sky was the colour of old pewter, and there was a wind coming down off the ridge that smelled like rain. He sat in the truck for almost 10 minutes before he made himself get out. The hard case rode on the passenger seat beside him, seatbelt fastened across it because that was how Margaret had always insisted things be transported, and old habits don't die just because the person who taught them to you does. When he finally stepped down from the cab, his left hand was trembling visibly, and he paused with one palm flat against the truck door to steady himself. Then he lifted the case, tucked it under his arm, and walked across the gravel toward the door. Inside, the range smelled the way ranges always smell. Solvent, powder, cold concrete, and the faint ozone tang of fluorescent lights that had been on for too many hours. 4 men stood at the counter, all of them younger than 40, and behind the counter was the rangemaster, whose name tag read Tyler. Tyler was a tall young man with a shaved head and a neatly trimmed goatee, and the kind of confidence that comes from being the biggest person in most rooms you walk into. When Earl set the case down on the counter, Tyler looked at him and gave a small, polite smile, the kind you give to someone who has clearly wandered into the wrong establishment. "Can I help you, sir?" The three other men at the counter, who had been laughing about something, went quiet. One of them was filling out a rental form, the other two were buying ammunition. All of them turned just slightly to watch. Earl did not notice. Or if he did not let it show on his face. The case clicked open with two dull metallic snaps, and what was inside it, resting on yellowed foam that had been cut to fit it exactly, was a rifle the likes of which the younger men in that room had only ever seen in photographs. The M14 is a piece of American military history. It was the standard service rifle of the United States Armed Forces from 1959 to 1970. A 20-inch barreled semi-automatic chambered in 7.62 NATO, and its career was both celebrated and cut short by a jungle it was never really designed to fight in. By the mid-1960s, the M16 had begun to replace it across most branches, but certain units, certain specialists, certain men in certain situations kept carrying the M14 long after the paperwork said they shouldn't. The rifle inside Earl Whitaker's case had the look of a weapon that had been fired, cleaned, and stored by someone who understood it intimately. The stock was walnut, dark with age and handling. The metal was dulled, but it was not pitted, and it was not rusted, and it had the particular sheen that only comes from decades of being oiled by hands that knew what they were doing. There was a small, deliberate notch carved into the underside of the stock near the butt plate. 3 lines, short and clean, cut by a knife a very long time ago. Tyler looked at the rifle for several seconds without saying anything. Then he looked at Earl. Then he looked back at the rifle. "All right," he said, in a voice that was trying very hard to be casual. "What can I do for you, sir?" Earl cleared his throat. His voice, when it came out, was thinner than he would have liked. "I was hoping to take her out to the line. Put a few rounds through her. Been a long while." Tyler nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is about to refuse something but hasn't decided yet how to phrase it. "That's a beautiful piece, sir. Really is. But we got some concerns about letting a weapon that will be fired on our line without an inspection. Liability stuff, you understand." Earl understood. He also understood the way Tyler's eyes had drifted for just a fraction of a second to Earl's trembling left hand and then back up to his face. "I could strip her for you," Earl said. "Show you she's in good working order. I know her." And that was when Tyler laughed. It was not a cruel laugh exactly. It was the laugh of a man who has been told something so unexpected that his first instinct is disbelief. "Sir," he said, shaking his head, "with all due respect, I don't think you understand what you're asking. This is an M14. This isn't some bolt action you pop open and clean with a toothbrush. We got liability concerns. We got protocol." The 3 men at the counter had fully turned now. One of them, a wide-shouldered guy in a grey hoodie, was watching with an expression that was hard to read. The other 2 were smirking. Earl felt the tremor in his hand get worse, and he pressed his palm flat against the side of the case to still it. He did not raise his voice. He did not raise his eyes. He just said very quietly, "Son, I carried one of these for 14 months in a place you've only read about. I'd like to strip it. That's all I'm asking." The silence that followed lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it was a long 2 seconds. Tyler blinked. He glanced sideways at one of the men at the counter, a skinny kid in a flat-brim cap, and the kid gave him a small smile that said, "Do it." And Tyler, because he was 26, and because he had 3 other guys watching, and because something about the old man's quiet certainty had gotten under his skin in a way he didn't want to admit, pulled his phone out of his back pocket. "All right," he said. "All right, old-timer, tell you what. You want a stripper? Stripper? I'll even time you. But here's the deal. The manual says field stripping an M14 to its basic components, 8 pieces, should take a trained Marine about a minute, give or take. So if you can do it in under a minute, we'll talk about letting you on the line. Sound fair?" He said it with a smile, a generous smile. The smile of a man doing someone a favour. Earl looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the rifle. Then he looked down at his own hands, at the tremor in the left one, at the liver spots, at the thin wedding band he had never taken off. He thought about Margaret. He thought about a boy named Danny Reyes, who had taught him to do this in a muddy bunker in 1968. Because Danny was from New Jersey, and could do it in his sleep, and thought Earl, who was from Tennessee, couldn't. He thought about how Danny had been dead for 57 years. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his denim jacket and pulled out a red shop rag, folded once. "I'd like to ask one favour," Earl said. Tyler raised an eyebrow. "Sure." Earl held up the rag. "I'd like to do it blindfolded." The skinny kid in the flat-brim cap made a noise that was half a cough and half a laugh. Tyler's eyebrow climbed higher. He looked around at the other men, and then back at Earl, and for the first time something flickered across his face that was not amusement. It was not quite respect either. It was something in between. A small, uncertain thing. "Sir," he said, "I don't know if that's—" "I can do it," Earl said. His voice was steady. The tremor was still in his hand, but it was not in his voice. 47 seconds. That's my best time. Probably slower now. I'll be fair. You give me a minute and a half. If I don't have her apart by then, I'll walk out that door and never bother you again." Tyler looked at the men at the counter. The wide-shouldered guy in the grey hoodie, the one Earl had noticed watching quietly, was not smirking anymore. He was leaning forward slightly, both hands flat on the counter. His name was Marcus Hale. He was a former Army Ranger, 34 years old, and he had just noticed the notch on the rifle stock. 3 clean lines. He had seen a rifle marked that way exactly once before, in a museum display case at Fort Benning beside a small brass plaque, and the memory of that plaque was doing something very strange to his pulse. But he said nothing. Not yet. "All right," Tyler said, and the smile was still there, but it had thinned. "Blindfolded. 90 seconds, starting on my mark." Earl picked up the red rag and folded it a second time, and as he did so, the last conversation he'd ever had with Danny Reyes drifted up through 57 years of silence and settled, clear as a bell, inside his chest. It was 1968, and they were in a sandbagged observation post about 2 clicks north of a village whose name the Americans could not pronounce, and the Vietnamese had long since stopped bothering to teach them. Danny Reyes was 22 years old, a corporal, and he was the best shot in the platoon. He had a face full of freckles and a laugh that didn't belong in that country, and he had adopted Earl, who was 21 and from a town of 600 people, the way older brothers sometimes adopt younger ones without needing to explain why. On the night in question, the two of them were running a perimeter watch, and Danny was teaching Earl, for the 4th time that week, how to field strip the M14 without looking. "You gotta feel it, Earl. You gotta let your hands do the thinking, because one of these nights it's gonna be dark and it's gonna be raining, and you're gonna have a malfunction, and you're not gonna have time to squint at the trigger group and figure out which piece goes where. Your hands have to know. You hear me?" Earl had heard him. Earl had practiced every night for 6 weeks, in the bunker, in the dark, with a rag tied over his eyes because Danny insisted on it. If you can do it blind, you can do it in any kind of trouble. Earl had gotten his time down to 49 seconds, then 48. Then, on the night before the operation that would change everything, 47, Danny had whooped and clapped him on the back and called him a Tennessee miracle, and the two of them had eaten cold beans out of a can and watched the stars come up over the jungle. 6 hours later, Danny Reyes was dead. The specifics did not matter anymore, or they mattered too much, and Earl had spent 57 years deciding which. What mattered, what had always mattered, was that on the morning Earl came home from that war, he had not been able to field strip an M14 for almost a decade without his hands shaking so badly he had to stop. And then one day, slowly, he had started practicing again. In the shed, in the dark, with a rag tied over his eyes, the way Danny had taught him. He had kept practicing for 50 years, not every day, not every week, but often enough that his hands remembered, even when his mind was getting fuzzy around the edges, even when the tremor came. Because some things, once a man like Danny Reyes teaches them to you, become a way of staying close to him after he's gone. Earl opened his eyes. Tyler was watching him with the phone in his hand. The 4 men at the counter were watching too, and the silence in the range had taken on a quality that none of them could quite name. Earl folded the rag a 3rd time and tied it carefully over his eyes. Then he placed both hands, palms down, on the countertop beside the rifle, and he breathed in once, slowly, and out. "Ready when you are, son." The stopwatch app made a small digital beep. Earl's hands moved. Anyone who has ever watched a Marine field strip a service rifle knows that it looks, at its best, like a small silent dance. There is a rhythm to it. Pull the operating rod handle. release the bolt, rotate the safety, depress the trigger group release, separate the stock from the receiver, remove the operating rod, remove the bolt, remove the spring. 8 pieces laid out in a specific order, in a specific pattern, on a flat surface. Earl's hands did not tremble, not once. The left one, the one that had spilled coffee that morning, the one that sometimes could not hold a pen, was moving with the precise, unhurried economy of a man who had done this movement, in one form or another, every week for 50 years. His fingers found each catch, each lever, each pin without any hesitation whatsoever. The trigger group came away clean. The stock separated from the receiver with a soft wooden thunk. The operating rod slid out along its track and came to rest on the counter beside the other parts with almost no sound at all. Tyler, watching the phone in his hand, felt his mouth go dry. The 4 men at the counter had stopped pretending to do anything else. The skinny kid in the flat-brim cap had his mouth slightly open. A man with a beard, one of the ones who had been buying ammunition, had set his wallet down and forgotten about it entirely. Marcus Hale, the former ranger in the grey hoodie, was staring at Earl's hands as though he were watching a ghost. Because Marcus had field-stripped an M14 himself a number of times in training, out of historical interest, and he knew exactly what speed looked like and exactly what speed meant. And this speed, this particular quality of speed, was not something you got from being a trained Marine. This was something you got from being a trained Marine who had then, for reasons most men would never need to have, kept practicing for half a century without ever forgetting why. At 31 seconds, 5 of the 8 pieces were on the counter. At 38, 7. At 43, the last piece, the bolt, came free of the receiver, and Earl placed it, without looking, precisely 1 inch to the left of the operating rod, the way Danny Reyes had taught him to place it so you could find each part by touch in the dark. Tyler's voice, when it came, was very small. 47 seconds. He looked up from the phone. Earl still had the rag tied over his eyes. His hands were resting, palms down, on the counter beside the disassembled rifle. He was very still, and then, without a word, without anyone asking him to, Earl picked up the first piece and began to put the rifle back together, in reverse order, backward, the way Danny had made him practice on the nights when the 49 seconds wasn't good enough. Because Danny had said, if you can do it forward and backward, you can do it in any kind of trouble at all. Tyler did not start the timer again. He just watched. Everyone watched. And Marcus Hale, whose pulse was now thudding audibly in his ears, slid his own phone out of his pocket very quietly, typed a name into the search bar and hit enter. The rifle came back together in 51 seconds. When Earl untied the rag and opened his eyes, the light of the fluorescent bulb seemed very bright, and for a moment he was not quite sure where he was. Then he saw Tyler's face. Tyler was standing very still behind the counter. The phone was still in his hand, but he had forgotten about it. His mouth was slightly open. His eyes had the specific, unfocused quality of a man who has just had his understanding of a situation rearranged without his permission. The 3 men at the counter had not moved. One of them, the skinny kid in the flat-brim cap, was looking at Earl with an expression that was no longer a smirk. It was something closer to awe, mixed with something that might have been shame. Marcus Hale was looking at his phone. He had not looked up in almost 2 minutes. Earl folded the red rag carefully and put it back in his jacket pocket. Then he looked at Tyler, and his voice was as quiet as it had been when he first walked in. I'd still like to put a few rounds down range, if that's all right. Tyler opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Sir, he said, and it came out rough, and he cleared his throat and tried again. Sir, I owe you an apology. I shouldn't have laughed. That was out of line. Please, let me get you signed in and I'll take you out to the line myself on the house for as long as you want. Earl gave a small nod. Not warmly exactly, but not coldly either. It was the nod of a man who had accepted apologies before and knew they rarely meant what the people giving them thought they meant. I appreciate that, son. He reached for his wallet. But I'll pay like everybody else. Wouldn't feel right otherwise. And it was at exactly that moment, with Earl's hand halfway to his wallet and Tyler halfway through reaching for the sign-in sheet, that Marcus Hale, still looking at his phone, said in a voice that did not quite sound like his own, Sir, excuse me. Sir, I'm sorry, but I have to ask you something. Earl turned. Marcus was holding up his phone. On the screen was a page with a photograph on it. The photograph was black and white, and it showed a very young man, maybe 21 or 22, in a Marine Corps dress uniform, with a row of medals across his chest. The young man had a serious, slightly shy smile and a small scar on his left eyebrow. Earl looked at the photograph for a long time. He did not say anything. Marcus's voice was very careful. "Sir, is your name Earl Whittaker?" Earl nodded once. Marcus looked at the phone again. Then he looked at Earl. Then he looked down at the rifle on the counter, at the 3 small notches carved into the underside of the stock near the butt plate. "Sir," he said, and his voice had thickened. "Sir, are you the Earl Whittaker who was awarded the Navy Cross in 1969 for the action on Hill 488? Tyler, who had been holding a pen in his hand, heard the pen hit the counter. He did not remember dropping it. Earl Whittaker said nothing for a long moment. His eyes had gone somewhere far away, the way old eyes sometimes do when a name is spoken that has not been spoken aloud in decades. He did not answer Marcus's question. He did not need to, because Marcus, who was now standing up straight, whose hands had come down to his sides in a posture that Tyler recognized with a jolt of dawning understanding, was already speaking again. "Gentlemen," Marcus said, and his voice carried across the range in a way that made everyone turn, "you are standing in the presence of Sergeant Earl Whittaker, United States Marine Corps, retired. In November of 1969, Sergeant Whittaker's squad was ambushed at a forward observation post on a ridge designated Hill 488. 17 Marines were pinned down by a numerically superior force. The squad leader was killed in the first volley. The radio man was killed 30 seconds later. Sergeant Whittaker, then a corporal, took command of the squad, organised a defensive perimeter, and over the course of the following 6 hours, personally carried 4 wounded Marines to cover under sustained enemy fire. When his rifle was damaged by a grenade blast, he took the rifle from a fallen enemy combatant and continued to return fire until relief arrived at dawn. 14 of the 17 Marines in his squad survived. He was awarded the Navy Cross, which is the second highest military decoration that can be awarded to a member of the United States Navy or Marine Corps, 1 rank below the Medal of Honor. Marcus paused. The range was completely silent. "And the reason I recognize the rifle, sir, is because there is one very similar to it in a display case at the Marine Corps Museum in Quantico, with a small plaque underneath it that notes it was the personal service weapon of Corporal Earl Whittaker during the action on Hill 488. But the one in the museum is a replica." Marcus looked at the rifle on the counter. The original was returned to Sergeant Whittaker upon his discharge in 1971, at his request. There's a photograph of him receiving it. Marcus held up the phone again. On the screen now was a different photograph. A young Earl Whittaker, in dress uniform, shaking hands with an officer whose face Tyler did not recognize but whose collar insignia he very much did. "That rifle on the counter," Marcus said, "has 3 notches carved into the stock. Those notches represent the 3 Marines in Sergeant Whittaker's squad who did not come home from Hill 488. He carved them himself on the flight back to the States. Am I correct, sir?" Earl was looking at the rifle. His left hand, the one with the tremor, had come to rest very gently on the walnut stock, fingertips over the 3 small lines. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, and it was not loud. "Danny Reyes," he said. "Michael Kowalski, Tommy Bell." He lifted his hand from the stock. Danny was 22, Mike was 20, Tommy was 19. Tommy had been in country for 11 days. The silence that followed was not the silence of a room that had simply gone quiet. It was the silence of a room in which something had shifted in a way that nobody in it was going to be able to reverse. Tyler was staring at Earl. He was staring at him the way a man stares at a painting he has walked past every day for 10 years and only just now realized is a masterpiece. His hands were hanging at his sides. His mouth was slightly open. He looked, for the first time since Earl had walked into the building, like exactly what he was, a 26-year-old man who had just understood in one blinding instant the full measure of his own smallness. The skinny kid in the flat-brim cap had taken off his cap. He was holding it in both hands in front of his chest. He did not seem to know he had done it. The man with the beard, the one who had been buying ammunition, had turned slightly away, and he was wiping something from the corner of his eye with the back of his wrist, and he was pretending he was not doing it. Marcus Hale squared his shoulders. He brought his right hand up slowly, deliberately, palm flat, fingers together, and he saluted. It was a perfect salute, the kind of salute that does not happen by accident. Earl looked at him for a long moment. He did not have to return it. He was in civilian clothes, and he had been retired for 54 years, and there was nobody in the building who outranked him in any way that mattered. But Earl Whittaker had been raised to return a salute, and some things do not leave a man no matter how long he lives. He straightened, slowly, as much as his back would allow, and he brought his own right hand up, and he returned the salute with the precision of a man who had not forgotten how. Then he lowered his hand and he cleared his throat and he said very softly, "At ease, son." Marcus let his hand drop. Tyler found his voice. It was a thin voice, and it was a voice that was trying very hard not to crack. "Sergeant Whittaker," he said, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I shouldn't have laughed. I shouldn't have. Earl held up a hand. "Son?" Tyler stopped. Earl looked at him for a long moment, and there was no anger in his face. There was no triumph in it either. There was something else. Something that Tyler was not going to fully understand for several years. "I want you to listen to me carefully," Earl said, "because I am only going to say this once, and then I am going to go out to the line and put a few rounds through this rifle, the way I came here to do. You didn't know who I was. That's not your fault. How could you know? But you knew I was an old man, and you knew my hand was shaking, and you saw a case with a rifle in it, and you decided I couldn't. And you decided out loud, in front of other men, so they would laugh with you. And that, son, is what you should be sorry for. Not for what you didn't know about me, but for what you decided about me, because every old man you see with a shake in his hand has a story. Maybe not like mine, probably not like mine, but a story, and the next time, you're going to remember that." Tyler nodded. He could not speak. "Now," Earl said, and his voice softened, "I'd like my rifle and a box of 240 grain match, please, and I'd like to go out to the line." Tyler moved. He moved the way a man moves when he has been given a second chance he's not sure he deserves. He signed Earl in himself. He waived the range fee despite Earl's insistence on paying. He carried the hard case out to Lane 1 personally. He set up a target at 100 yards without being asked. He handed Earl a set of ear protection and a pair of shooting glasses, and then, because he did not know what else to do, he stepped back and stood at parade rest behind Earl's shooting position and waited. The other men in the range had, without any of them saying anything about it, quietly moved to the back of the observation area. They were not leaving. They were just giving space. Marcus Hale remained closest, 3 lanes back, with his arms folded and his eyes on Earl. Earl laid the M14 on the shooting bench. He loaded a 20-round magazine slowly, thumbing each cartridge in with the unhurried precision of a man who did not believe in rushing things that mattered. When the magazine was full, he seated it with the heel of his palm and let the bolt go forward. The sound of an M14 bolt going into battery is a specific and particular sound, and every man in the range heard it, and felt something shift slightly in their chest. Earl took his position. His stance was not textbook. Textbook stance was for young men. Earl's stance was the stance of a man who had learned to shoot in positions that nobody in any textbook had ever imagined, and who had made peace with his own body a long time ago. He settled the buttstock into the pocket of his shoulder. He took 3 breaths. On the 4th exhale, he fired. The shot was a single, clean crack, and the target at 100 yards showed a hole appear 2 inches below and slightly right of the centre of the bullseye. Earl made a small adjustment, the kind of adjustment a man makes with a rifle he has not fired in a long time and whose quirks he's remembering one at a time. The second shot went into the centre of the bullseye. The third shot went through the same hole. The fourth went through the same hole. The fifth went through the same hole. By the 10th shot, the centre of the target had a single ragged opening the size of a quarter, and the men in the back of the observation area had stopped breathing. Earl fired the 20 rounds at a rhythm of 1 every 4 seconds, which is not a fast rhythm and was not meant to be, and every single one of them went into that same ragged opening. When he was done, he cleared the chamber, removed the magazine, laid the rifle carefully on the bench, and stood for a long time with his hands resting on the wood, looking down range at what he had done. Tyler, behind him, said softly, "Sergeant." Earl did not turn. "Yes, son." "My grandfather was at Incheon." Earl nodded slowly. "Good unit. Hard unit. He passed in 2019. I never asked him about it. I never asked him anything. I just thought he was an old man." Earl turned then, and he looked at Tyler for a long moment, and then he did something that Tyler was not expecting. He reached out very gently, and he put his hand on Tyler's shoulder. His left hand, the one with the tremor, and the tremor was there, and it was plain to see. but Tyler did not look away from it. "Son," Earl said, "next time you see an old man sitting alone somewhere, you go sit down next to him and you ask. That's all. Just ask. They'll tell you or they won't, but you ask. That's how you pay a debt you didn't know you owed." Tyler's eyes had filled. He nodded. He did not trust his voice. Word of what had happened at the Ridgeline Tactical Shooting Range that Tuesday afternoon did not spread the way such things sometimes do in the age of smartphones and social media. Marcus Hale, who was the only person in the building who had been carrying a phone during the incident, never posted anything. When asked about it later by a local reporter who had gotten wind of the story from a different source, Marcus said only, "That moment wasn't mine to share. That moment belonged to Sergeant Whitaker and to the 3 men whose names are carved on that rifle. If he ever wants the story told, he'll tell it himself." The story did spread eventually, but it spread the way old stories have always spread. In small pieces, in lowered voices, at the diner across the street, at the VFW hall in the next town over, at the Sunday morning gathering at the Methodist church Earl sometimes attended when the weather was good. Within a month, everybody in the county knew. Earl was not comfortable with knowing that everybody knew. He had lived 54 years in a careful, humble silence, and he was not certain that he wanted that silence broken at the age of 78. But certain things happened that he did not expect. A young woman named Sarah Kowalski, who lived in Minneapolis and who was the 31-year-old granddaughter of Michael Kowalski, one of the 3 names carved on Earl's rifle, received a letter. The letter had been written by Earl, laboriously, over the course of 3 evenings at his kitchen table with a fountain pen that had belonged to his wife. In the letter, Earl introduced himself. He explained that he had served with her grandfather. He explained what had happened on Hill 488. He explained that Michael Kowalski had, in the last 20 minutes of his life, saved Earl's life by pulling him out of the path of a machine gun burst and taking the rounds himself. He explained that he had spent 57 years carrying the weight of that, and that he had always meant to write to the family, and that he had never been able to find the words, and that he was sorry it had taken him this long. Sarah Kowalski read the letter 3 times. Then she got on a plane. 3 weeks after the incident at the range, Earl Whitaker met the granddaughter of the man who had saved his life. They sat together at his kitchen table for 4 hours. She brought photographs. He brought a small wooden box he had kept on a shelf in his closet for half a century, containing a letter Michael Kowalski had been writing to his mother the night before the ambush, a letter that was never sent, that Earl had recovered from his friend's pack and had never known what to do with. Sarah read the letter with tears streaming down her face. She asked if she could keep it. Earl said yes. He said that was why he had kept it. He had been waiting. He had not known it, but he had been waiting for the person it was meant for. Tyler, the rangemaster, did something that nobody who had known him 6 months earlier would have predicted. He enlisted. He signed up for the Marine Corps on a Wednesday morning in the spring, 7 months after the incident, and he went through boot camp at Parris Island at the age of 27, which was older than most of his fellow recruits, but not so old that it raised eyebrows. He graduated as a private first class. He wrote Earl a letter from basic training. He wrote another from his first duty station. He sent a photograph of himself in dress blues standing at attention, with a small, shy smile that was not the smile of the young man who had laughed at an old Marine in a gun range. Earl kept the photograph on the mantel, next to the folded flag in the triangular wooden case. Marcus Hale and Earl became, in the unlikely way that men who have recognized something in each other sometimes become, friends. Marcus began driving out to Earl's house on Saturday afternoons. They would sit on the back porch and drink coffee and not say very much. Sometimes Marcus would ask a question about the war, and sometimes Earl would answer, and sometimes he would just look at the tree line and say nothing, and Marcus had the sense never to press. When the summer came, Marcus helped Earl clean out the workshop shed. Together they found things Earl had forgotten he owned. A set of tools that had belonged to Earl's father. A box of letters from Margaret, written during the years they had been dating, before Earl had shipped out. A photograph Earl had never seen before, taken by a combat photographer he did not remember, of him and Danny Reyes sitting on a sandbag wall, laughing about something, their rifles across their laps. Earl framed the photograph and hung it over the kitchen table where he could see it every morning, and in the fall of that year, on a Tuesday in October that was almost exactly 1 year to the day from the afternoon he had walked into the Ridgeline Tactical Shooting Range, Earl Whitaker did something he had never done in his life. He accepted an invitation to speak at the Veterans Day Assembly at the local high school. He stood on the small wooden stage in the gymnasium in a suit that he had not worn in 10 years, which was a little loose on him now, but which was clean and pressed. The gymnasium was full. 500 teenagers, their teachers, their parents, the mayor, the principal, the local VFW colour guard, and in the second row, wearing his dress blues for the first time since boot camp graduation, Private First Class Tyler Morrow, who had taken 2 days of leave to drive home for this. Earl spoke for 11 minutes. He did not speak about Hill 488. He did not speak about the Navy Cross. He did not speak about himself at all, really. He spoke about 3 young men named Danny Reyes, Michael Kowalski, and Tommy Bell. He told the students about where each of them had come from, and what each of them had wanted to do with their lives, and what each of them had loved, and what each of them had lost, and what each of them had given, and what each of them would never get to become. He told them that Danny Reyes had wanted to open a mechanics shop with his brother in Paterson, New Jersey, that Michael Kowalski had been accepted to the University of Minnesota to study architecture and had planned to start in the fall after his tour ended, that Tommy Bell had a girlfriend back in Alabama named Ruth who had written him a letter every single day he had been in country, and that Tommy had gotten to read 9 of those letters before he died. And then, at the end, Earl said something that the students would talk about for years. He said, "You will live your lives, and most of you will live them well, and I hope every single one of you does. But I want you to remember something for me. Every old man you pass in a grocery store, every old woman you hold a door for, every person you see shuffling across a parking lot with a cane or a walker or a tremor in their hand, they were all young once. They were all beautiful once. They all had somebody who loved them, and somebody they loved, and a life that felt as big to them as yours feels to you right now. And most of them carry something they did, or something that was done to them, or something they lost. And you will never know what it is unless you ask. So ask. Not so you can hear the story. Ask so they know somebody noticed. That's all any of us ever really wanted, to be noticed. That's the whole secret. That's the whole thing." Earl stepped back from the microphone. The gymnasium was silent for a long second, and then 500 teenagers, their teachers, their parents, the mayor, the principal, the colour guard, and Private First Class Tyler Morrow all stood up at once, and the applause that followed went on for almost 3 minutes, and Earl Whittaker, who had not cried in public since the day Margaret's casket had been lowered into the ground, stood on that stage with his left hand trembling and tears running down his face, and did not try to hide any of it. Earl Whittaker passed away on a quiet morning in March, 3 years after the afternoon he had walked into the Ridgeline Tactical Shooting Range. He died in his own bed, in the small house off the county road where he had lived for half a century, with a photograph of Margaret on the nightstand and a folded American flag in a triangular wooden case on the mantel. His funeral was attended by more people than the little church could hold. The overflow stood outside on the church lawn, in the early spring sunshine, and listened to the service through a set of speakers that had been set up in the morning. There was a colour guard from the Marine Corps. There was a rifle volley. There was a folded flag presented by a young captain, whose grandfather, it turned out, had served with Earl at a different base in a different year, and had told the captain stories about him when the captain was a small boy. In the second row, in a brand new set of dress blues with a lance corporal's chevrons, sat Tyler Morrow. In the row behind him sat Marcus Hale. In the row behind Marcus, in a black dress she had bought specifically for the occasion, sat Sarah Kowalski, who had flown in from Minneapolis the night before, and who carried in her purse a small wooden box containing a letter her grandfather had written to his mother in November of 1969 that had never been sent. In Earl's will, he left the M14 rifle with its 3 carved notches to the Marine Corps Museum in Quantico, with a note specifying that the replica in the display case be retired and the original be placed in its stead. The museum accepted. The display case was updated that summer. Underneath the rifle now is a small brass plaque, slightly larger than the old one, which reads, "This rifle was carried by Sergeant Earl Whittaker, USMC, during the action on Hill 488, November 1969, for which he was awarded the Navy Cross. The 3 notches on the stock commemorate Corporal Daniel Reyes, Private First Class Michael Kowalski, and Private Thomas Bell, who did not return from that action. Sergeant Whittaker carried this rifle and their memory for 54 years, and if you walk through that museum on any given weekday, you will sometimes see a young Marine in dress blues standing in front of that case for a long time, not moving, and sometimes he will reach up and touch the glass very lightly with the tips of his fingers, and then he will square his shoulders and walk on. Because Earl Whittaker was right. That is how you pay a debt you didn't know you owed. You ask, you listen, you remember, you notice. And when it is your turn, you carry what you were given, the way the ones before you carried it, all the way to the end. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the old man in your own life you never got to ask, or the one you still can, please take a second to subscribe to this channel. We tell these stories because they deserve to be told, and because men like Earl Whittaker deserve to be remembered. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and the next time you pass an old man with a tremor in his hand, remember the 3 notches on a walnut stock. Thank you for watching.